Guten Erev Shabbos. By the time you hear this, it'll be Bez Hashem Motzei Shabbos. I'm at the Ohel now as part of the Kinos Hashluchim Hoilomi, and we had yesterday a full day series of shiurim, and most prominently was presented by Rabbi Hershel Schachter, who is the Rosh Hashiva of Yeshivas Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, otherwise known as YU. Really inspiring to see his phenomenal command of such a wide range of areas of halacha, and very, very to spend time with him, and also appreciate people coming over and saying that they're listening to the shiur on a regular, that they sit down and follow the slides inside. So that's encouraging. Let's go. And number one is when davening alone, and therefore omitting the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim. You would not say, when you're davening alone, you wouldn't say Hashem, Hashem, Keil Racham V'Chanun. And therefore, so if you take a look in the Siddur, so it says, so without going into too much arichas, I think we may have even discussed it this year before, but in the Siddur, which I was able to publish, there's a long note about this. And there's a letter of the Rebbe where the Rebbe refers to the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tov Kuf Samach Vav. In Siman Tov Kuf Samach Vav, the Mechaber says, that's talking about slichas, that if you are davening alone, you aren't eligible to say Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim as a chiyuv, but you can say them kekoire b'toire. And the Rebbe refers to this, and someone asked the Rebbe, this is going back 60 years ago, Mr. why in the Tilas Hashem Siddur is a difference between Minche and Shachris. At Minche it said there that Amispal b'yochid einei mezeh, and at Shachris didn't have this comment. And the Rebbe's response was, Lo hispik hazman lahagiyoi, something like that. That, however, what's remarkable, which you have a photocopy in the Ha'ora, in the Siddur, is the following. In the Master, in the Seder HaAvodah Siddur, which was published in Vilna, Tofresh Ayin Aleph, it says, Tav al Peshav Sim Choshim Chem Gas Yasem Shom, Tazim Shem Sef Sakrimenu Amor, Kayim Vakrib Shem Hashem. Then it said, before the words V'Shom Ne'emar, there it says, Hamispal B'Yochid, Ein Oimer Zeh. So before saying V'Shom Ne'emar, and now somehow when the Kahos reprinted the Siddur in Tofshinei approximately, they changed it around, and as a result, you've got this disjointed situation of V'Shom Ne'emar without anything. And my understanding is that what should have been the correction, which the Rebbe would have preferred, or was recommending to that the whole thing Hashem is Baal B'Yochid Einei Mezeh should have been left. Hashem, Hashem, Kerachon V'Chanon. You can say it. That's the halach in Siman Tov Kuf Samach Vav, and that's what we should be doing l'maisa. Let's go on to the next thing, which is come up several times, and that is, how do you deal with disused shul furniture? So, you've got a kedusha. You have the Mishnah in Megillah talks about kedushas kesforim, besakneses, chayva shalir. So you have various levels of kedusha. So now the situation is you've Baruch Hashem upgraded your shul. You got new furniture. What do you do with the old furniture? So it's got a kedusha. To say that you should bury it, that is a very difficult thing. How do you find space to bury an old Aron Kodesh and so on? So looking for a different solution, whether there's a way of buying out the kedusha. So we have in Torah it talks about chilul ma'aser sheni. You put down some money and the kedusha is transferred from the payers, from the produce, onto the money. So is there a way of being poide to buy out those articles? So the kedusha should be transferred from the items onto the money, and the money you'll use for a davar shebekdusha. That's basically the method which we're looking at. And you look on your screen, you'll see that here we have from the Piskei Tshuvos. I think it's Simon Kufnan. But let's read what he has here over here. He brings that there are those that it seems that you cannot be. There's no way you can downgrade the kedusha, not even with going through the trustees of the community, Zayin Tuve Ha'ir. Then he says, however, the Acharonim have sought to find a lamed zchus, to find a way to make it easier for Am Kodesh, for our holy nation, to rely on the lenient opinions and the various methods which have been given. One is possibly that the Tashmish Kedusha shall Sefer Torah is only when it's possible that this will be repurposed for Sefer Torah, then you cannot sell them for mundane stuff because there's still the option of using them for Kedavar Kedusha. But if it's Tashmish Kedusha, like an Oren Kodesh, which the understanding is once they've finished their function as an Oren Kodesh because of an upgrade, let's say, so then it's as if Lachatchila, when you bought that, when you built that piece of furniture, it was the intention to use it as long as you need, and when you have an upgrade, then you'd be able to take the old ones and sell them and use them and take away their kedusha. So what should you do to summarize this? You have an old Oren Kodesh, Baruch Hashem, now you have a new one. What do you do with the old one? So we do have a way of you buy it, you give the trust of the shul, you give them a few pounds, whatever it may be, and with that, the kedusha of that article, of that Oren Kodesh, now goes on to the cash which you have in hand, and you'll use that for Dvarim Shebekdusha, for perhaps towards the new Oren Kodesh or some improvement over there. What will you do with the old cupboard? So you have two options. Either you can use it now for Chulin, or you can just dismantle it and dispose of it, either way. Let's go on to our next question on our list of questions. So we've dealt with this in the past, and therefore I'm not going to give it too much time. May a man roll up his beard on Shabbos? So b'mikre just happened to be, I noticed last Shabbos, a man who came into the mikveh with a very short beard, and later I saw him afterwards with a very long beard. So right after mikveh, to roll up your beard would mean also probably squeezing out water from the hair, and that's not allowed on Shabbos. So you have to leave time for the water to dry out. But then here's the question about rolling it. Why would you think it's a shaila? Well, we know that for plaiting hair is osur for a woman to plait her hair on Shabbos, and that we learned from Kadosh Baruch Hu took Chava and he plaited her hair and wrote it Vayiven Hashem Elokim es Hatzela. So one of the translations, Vayiven Hashem Elokim es Hatzela, Tzela refers to that plait, and Hashem plaited her hair and how when he presented her to Adam. So because it uses the word Vayiven, so it's understood that plaiting is considered building. And just to understand that what building, what does it mean of building? That you take various loose particles, loose items, and you create a structure. That's why also the word gevino, which means cheese. So to make cheese, how do you make a hard cheese? You take the milk solids, they're all loose pieces, and they somehow become galvanized to become a single solid. And therefore the word gevino has in it the word of benio, of building. If you make cheese on Shabbos, it would come under a tool of baina. So all right, so that was baina is. So then we have understood that taking particles and making a structure is baina. Therefore, you could say the same thing with taking hair, loose hair, and binding them into a structure could be a problem of baina. So that's the background to this shaila. Therefore, rolling the beard and creating some kind of structure with it that's where the question comes from. However, on your sheet, you'll see a reference to Reb Chaim Noah where he raises the question, and in the Poyel he remains that for most people it's not such a important structure somehow, and therefore he leaves it Lemaisa that it's okay. And I can certainly confirm that that is the minig Lemaisa, that men who do roll their beards are makel to roll them up on Shabbos if necessary. We'll go on to the fourth question. There's a food which called malawach, and it is a kind of perhaps a flaky pastry. And so I was asked about the broch. Now, it happens to be that this particular recipe, this product which the person was asking about, has actually, after flour, the first ingredient is water. So if it would be majority, how do you make flaky pastry? You use margarine, something like that. And then, so the main bimkoim liquid is actually not water. But here they actually put water before the margarine, and therefore would be a shaila of whether it's hamoitzi or not. So here you see on the screen, so I've taken here from a contemporary sefer, I've mentioned him before. It's called Sharei Habrocha from Harav Shitzburg, and he writes malawach. So he writes it's a Eastern and Oriental food made from kind of flaky pastry, and largely it's kneaded with margarine and then baked or fried. Now, perhaps it's also important to clarify if it's fried. Deep frying is bishul, but if it's just to grease the pan, then that actually might qualify as a fio. So that doesn't really solve the problem. To explain what I'm saying, pasta, lokshen, which is cooked, there's no way it's hamoitzi, because something which is cooked is not hamoitzi, it's not lechem. So if something were deep fried, that would also not qualify as lechem. And we're coming up to Hanukkah, and donuts, which are deep fried, you can have, if you have bread more, if you have mazonis more than a certain amount, your kaver suda becomes hamoitzi. But donuts, because they are deep fried rather than baked, you can have as much as you want, and you still will not make hamoitzi on it because it's fried, not baked. But this is not so clear. Now, so he writes that bracha rishoina is mezonis, unless you kaver suda, and they are mezonis, and then it's ala michya. So that's very nice. That's what he writes in the main list. But then in his notes, he has a note Chavtes, you can see here on the screen. He writes from the Sefer V'Zois HaBrocha that sometimes the margarine does not exceed in volume over the water. Therefore, there's room for a sofik what the brocha should be on this food, and therefore this V'Zois HaBrocha Sefer recommends having malawach b'toich hasu'uda. If you're doing it yourself, you should add a little bit. Make sure that to tip the balance, there should be a little bit more oil and margarine over the amount of water, and that way it'll be mezainis. Then he has another question, the second part of the note. Is it possible that the fact that malawach is a little bit hard, would that be reason to make it passable b'kisnin? Now, I've mentioned this numerous times, 3 opinions about passable b'kisnin. One, it is lechem shekoisisin me'enum ma'at, that's a mezainis dough, which is, it's made with meiperes. There's another day which says it's a pouch, lashon kis. And then there's third one, which is the Shittas of Haigoen, that it is kachin dakin. It's like a very thin, hard cracker. That's why, by the way, the Minhag HaSfardim is on the matzahs, which we use on Pesach. They, during the year, will make mezonos, because that's what Rav Goa says. It's kachin dakin or mezonos. It's not a bread which you'd have for a meal. It's something which you'd have just as a snack. Ashkenazim don't follow that, and that seems to be the Rebbe's view also. That's why he didn't bring this in the Siddur. They didn't bring Rav Hai Gaon in the Siddur, because that which Rav Hai Gaon is talking about aptly describes the matzahs which we use on Pesach. So how can you say Ein Odom Kaveh Bos Alei Suda when people are having it for Pesach, all 8 days of Pesach? And to start differentiating between Pesach and a whole year, that's linear, and that's why the Alter Rebbe took that out. But that's about the matzahs. But coming back, the malawach. So he's saying the fact that the malawach is a little bit hard is that reason to compare it to the crackers to make it mezainis. That's not good enough because it's not so hard, so much harder than bread. It's still a little bit soft. And therefore, you wouldn't put it on the same level as the crackers. So it seems to be that this Malawach story is not totally so clear. So again, let's summarize. If it actually has the majority liquid content, there's more oil or margarine more than water, then it's mezonos. But if there's actually more water, it's a shtickle suffix. Right, let's move on to the next point, and that is about someone's asked, and this is a question, unfortunately, a very well-known question, comes up again and again. Does a divorced woman have an obligation to cover her hair? So this is a quote from the Sefer Kvuda Bas Melech from Hagon Reb Moshe Wiener, and he published it many years ago. Rebbe encouraged him very much to print it as soon as possible, etc. So let's read. The Torah says, Torah forbade the exposure of the hair, of the head, prias roish, of a woman, whether married or not married, if she had been married, namely a widow or a divorcee. The cover, he writes, now that's the main text, then his notes. The covering of the head of almona or grusha is min haTorah, just like it is for a married woman, because we learn it from the story with Rabbi Shmuel. It talks about Ofora es Roisha Isha, where in the story of the Sota, the Kohen exposes the hair of the woman, and there it seems to be very clear that a woman who is no longer a virgin is included, that her hair would normally be covered. And therefore, it's evident that there's no room to allow a widow or a divorcee to have her hair uncovered, even it will cause great difficulty for her to find a shidduch because her hair is obviously covered, and even when there's a considerable loss, and like any other law, any other forbidden act, that one needs to do whatever you can not to violate that mitzvah. And he takes issue with the Igros Moshe, with Moshe Feinstein. And there is a story about a woman who was divorced, and I think, got divorced or widowed, I don't remember. And she felt that her covering her hair was a impediment for her to find employment, and she needed to feed her children. And Rabbi is a little bit lenient about this, not happy about it, but a little bit lenient. And Rabbi Wiener shows that that's not the case. There's no leeway on that. I just want to share with you one perhaps inspiring point about this. And that is that I know of someone, very prominent Rav, and his daughter got married, and very shortly afterwards, it was evidently wasn't a binyan adiyad at all, and there was a quick divorce, and she was considering of not wearing her sheitel because she never really got involved in the marriage properly. The father, this is going back 40 years ago, the father said to his daughter, you can buy a sheitel for, let's say, then it was, let's say, $200, $400. Then you can buy a sheitel which is used for the act, in the acts, in, how do you say, when they for plays, for actors, for videos, for television. So the actresses, when they want to use a shaitel, it's a much more expensive thing. Let's say if a normal shaitel would cost about $200, $300, this would cost 2,000 or more. And he says, I'm ready to take you to such a place, and you'll get a top quality shaitel. It'll look mamish, it'll look very, very natural. But then like this, you'll keep the mitzvah of not exposing your hair, which she did, and Baruch Hashem, later she remarried. So it is, there's no real leeway on it. Certainly, there's no free for all on saying, oh, because I'm no longer married, I don't have to cover my hair. You do have to cover, but we understand it's not an easy thing to keep up with. Okay, let's move on. So I teach in the high school over here in Bayas, London, and we were going through the yonim of tefillah, and we're talking about Birchas Krishma. And so in Kriyat Shema, in Yetzah HaMoiros, so you have Kodesh, Kodesh, Kodesh Hashem's voice, and also Baruch Kvod Hashem Mimkoimoi, because we're describing how the Malachim are saying Shir, and how you have Kodesh is the Shiras HaMalachim as it's described in Gemara, sorry, in Sefer Yeshaya, the vision of Yeshaya, and Baruch Kvod Hashem Mimkoimoi, that's from the vision of Yechezkel. Either way, so one of the girls asked, why does it have a vertical line after the word Kodesh? Now, in the Tilas Hashem Sidurim and Torah Siddur, depending on which edition of the Tilas Hashem, but there's many of these vertical lines, and you're asking, why is it there? So in my Siddur, I had written that it's from Tamei HaKriya, which is true and not totally true. I was curious to get to the bottom of it. So I tried to get hold of the codex, for the Aleppo Codex, which is the oldest Tanakh which is known today. And it's not like a Sefer Torah, which is written without any punctuation marks at all. It's written with the whole Masorah, with all the Tamei HaKriya. So I did not get access to the actual codex, but this is from the edition of Mordechai Breuer, who copied it from there, a faithful copy. So that's what you have on the screen. So that's the pasuk in Yeshaya, which happens to be also the Haftorah of Parshas Yisro. So you can see on the screen how there is a line after the word Kodesh. Now, that line is not a trop, it's not a cantillation mark, because this is a dargon, this is a tvir, Kadosh, Kadosh. So what's the line doing there? So the word for this line is sometimes referred to as psik, or sometimes referred to as posek. I'm not sure which is more accurate, but what's it doing there? So I'm going to read soon in a moment from what you have on the screen, but also I have a sefer called Tamei HaMikra from Weinfeld, I think it's more Huda Weinfeld, and it's a whole sefer, not a very large sefer, but exploring the background of the trop, of the cantillation marks which we have in Tanakh, and he also addresses this. Now, he puts this on the same group as, let's say, the Makaf. Makaf is like a hyphen which would connect two words, and it's not a trop, it's not a tune, but it's sometimes you have a word. Let's say, for example, why is it sometimes ace and s, sometimes s? What's the difference? So when it's got its own trop, its own cantillation, then it would be ace. When it's es hadover, it doesn't have its own trop, because it's, how do you say, annexed with the following, connected with the following word, then it doesn't need to have a trop. So that's what the makaf does. So the makaf doesn't have a tune, but it facilitates reading it better, reading the mikra better. So this is here too. This line is where there is a need to alert the reader that there should be some kind of pause. So although it's read Kadosh, Kadosh, so it seems to be just flowing, but actually this should be some kind of conscious pause over there. So let's explain this a little bit more. In the Torah, we could divide them into two main groups, Meshorsim and Malachim. We've got those who are more kind of putting the brakes on, like the Ebshei Fosuk, the Asnachto, the Zokev Koton, Revi. These are more pauses of different levels of intensity. Then we've got the Meshorsim. So they are leading. It's like an entry into, it's like preparing to go into the next one. And the same thing, Dargo Tvir. Tvir is a pause, and the Dargo is a Meshores. So again, Kadosh, Kadosh. So what you have here on the screen is from Reb Shabsi's Sefer. I've mentioned his name before. He lived in Premsela about 400 years ago, and he, a master of Dikduk, he put tremendous effort in researching the text of the Siddur, and he was applauded by the Vada Arba Rotzes to the point that any publisher of a Siddur has to check his text against the Siddur of Reb Shabsi Sefer. So in his writings had been in manuscript until about 30 years ago, perhaps. They were the Ksav Yad was actually owned by the London Bezdin, and about 30 years ago, some Talmidei Chachomim took to it and they published it. Fascinating stuff. So now he addresses this Kodesh. This is in his introduction. This is not on the spot in the Siddur itself, in Kedushas Yotzer, but it's in his introduction where he's describing his policies, the way he published his Siddur, where he puts a meseg, etc. So he says about Kodesh. Now he writes in Kodesh, there is a psik, there's this pause, this line between the Kodesh, the first one, and the second one. And that is to indicate there ought to be some kind of pause, slight pause, because he says the following. The other two have a built-in pause. The second Kodesh, which is a Tvir, is a pause. And the third Kodesh, which is a Tipcha, is also a pause. And therefore, it's got a built-in pause because of the trop. The first one, because it's a Meshores, then if it wouldn't have the line, you wouldn't realize that there ought to be a pause. Why is there need to have a pause? So he says, well, the three times Kodesh are three separate concepts, as we say in Avodat Zion, that we have Kaddish, that's the first one. Let's read over here the bottom quote. That's the translation of a Korosel Zevi Omar. Kaddish b'shmei merema b'esim elo b'eschinte. First, Kaddish is referring to the Hashem is exalted in the heavens, and he quotes from Reb Moshe Kohen that he's mufresh. Hashem is exalted from the world of the Galgalim, of the planets and of the constellations. Kaddish. So he said again. What's the lashon? B'shmei merema b'eschinte. Kiyim b'eschinte. Kloim bnei Odom ein lohem misha yoyre oisom olov milvad hanavim, that people are unaware other than through the Nevi'im, whatever his explanation is. Then the second Kaddish is al aro ovid gvurte, where in the earth his powerful deeds, mighty deeds are recognized, and Kaddish lo'olam ol me'almayo, for eternity. So the fact that the Targum breaks it down to three concepts, three sentences, describing each Kodesh, so the three separate concepts, and therefore there ought to be a pause between each Kodesh at the end of after each word of Kodesh. As I said, the second and third have an indigenous drop, tam mafsik, but the first one doesn't. That's why there's the need for the line. So this also it was a whole, for me, it was a learning curve to understand that there's a posik, or psik, which is one of the trop. And that's when I learned already, when I learned trop with my father, Shalom, as a child. So you see a psik, when it was like I knew it was that line is a pause. But there should be another type of the same line, but it's a posik without being a trop. That was something new to me. Okay. What do we have now further? Okay, I don't have it on the screen, but the other two more things which I want to share with you for today, and that is laundry that was wet at the onset of Shabbos and it dried out on Shabbos. Is it muksa for the entire Shabbos, or is it now no longer muksa? This was brought up, actually, we're learning in the evening, we're learning Gemara Be'er, for Daf Chov Zayin, and it talks about muksa. Now, practical thing, looking up in Shmir Shabbos Kelchoso, Perek Tezvov, we had this discussed it by the Shir in the evening. Is it okay to leave laundry on the line from before Shabbos? Now, I know that the Minhag HaNoshim Tzidkonios is that they would not leave washing on the line. It doesn't look nice, doesn't look Shabbosdik. And I appreciate that. The question is, Lahalocha, is that indeed the position Lahalocha? Or are you allowed to leave washing to hang from before Shabbos? So the Shmiras Shabbos Gechosa makes an interesting point, and he says, yes, it does say in the Mishnah about not hanging up laundry on Shabbos, so that people shouldn't suspect you did the washing on Shabbos. So he says the objection is only to the act of hanging the washing up on the line. That is an issue of Marasa Ayin. It looks like you just did the laundry. But to leave laundry hanging from before Shabbos that stays on the line on Shabbos, that is permitted. That's what he writes over there. So here's the other question. Now, in England, the weather is rather unpredictable. It can be you put out the washing and it's dried out, and then it starts raining. So you don't want it to have to dry all over again. So you left the washing from before Shabbos. It's dried out. Now you see the clouds are gathering. So you want to bring in the washing on Shabbos. So are you allowed to bring in the washing on Shabbos? This is so that it shouldn't get wet again. This is the question. So there we go. So the answer to this is if the way Shmiras Shabbos Gechosa writes, if it was sopping wet at the onset of Shabbos, you should consider it muksa for the rest of Shabbos. The reason being that sopping wet cloth, if you want to pick it up, so by you holding it, by you gripping it, inevitably it's going to cause a bit of squeezing. Some of the water will go a little elsewhere, and therefore he says you shouldn't be you should consider sopping wet clothing as muksa. And therefore, if it was so wet, not just a bit moist, but it was so wet on the onset of Shabbos, it remains muksa for the whole of Shabbos. That's what he writes in the psak inside. As we know, the Rav Neuvet was very close to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and so in the notes he brings from Shlomo Zalman that he's not so sure about that chumrah. He's a little bit noiter to be makel, even if it was sopping wet. And the reason is, what we learned in the Gemara is you have two types of muksa. You have something which was edible, and then you rejected it, and then it became edible again. The classic example is you had grapes, edible. Then you took them, you put them onto the rooftop to dry out. Now, once they're dried, raisins are geschmack and grapes are geschmack. But in the mushy state in between, they're not edible. So it was nire v'nidche, v'nire. So at the before Shabbos, you had taken the grapes and lifted them on the rooftop, and so they started becoming mushy. You didn't expect them to dry out. Then they dried out. So since there was the choy b'yadayim, you took edible grapes, you put them into a position that they're not edible, cause them not to be edible. That's as if you rejected them, and that's called muksa, the choy b'yadayim. You have a different type of muksa, well, a different situation, where it's not you didn't make it muksa, it was already muksa before. So you have the classic story of taking an animal which died, and you want to cut it up to feed your dogs. So that is mutter to do so. It's not because it's dochi mi'ikori. It was muksa before you started. And now that stigma came off on Shabbos. So then you are allowed to benefit from it. That's the difference between dochi mi'ikori or nire v'nitcha. Fine. Now, the Gemara then asks the question: what about what about our pot of food? We have the Erev Shabbos, so the pot is going to be reisches. It's boiling hot. It's you can't. It's not for most of us. It's so hot you can't eat it. And then you put it, you wrap it up in towels, whatever. And then comes Shabbos, and you're going to be edible. So why don't you say, oh, since Bein Hashmoshes, it was so hot it was inedible, therefore it should remain muksa for the rest of Shabbos. We don't say that. And why is that? Because it's they use the lotion of Gomre Bidei Adam. It was close to be able to be used, and therefore it's not considered muksa. There's various lashonis, Adam Eimet Matzape. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman is now struggling with the laundry. Is the laundry which was wet at the onset of Shabbos, is it comparable to the Groigeres V'tzimukim? Or can you compare it to the stam pots of boiling food, which is anticipated that is going to cool off shortly, and therefore it's not muksa? As I say, in the Panim, in any case, he says, my memory had failed me. I thought he said it's okay. In the Panim, he paskins that if it's sopping wet, it remains muksa for the whole of Shabbos. And the word of to compare it to the Kederis Reisches, it's not so poshut, because the time delay between till clothes are wet until they become dry again is quite a bit longer than for food to cool off when taken off the fire. Akolponim, the minig oilim is definitely to be machmir, not to consider sopping wet clothing that it should be muksa for the rest of Shabbos, and says one should be knowing that way. The last thing I want to share with you is someone asked me about Kriyat Shema al Hamita, and so I think it's Sefer HaMinhagim, which is taken from Hayom Yom. I don't have the exact reference in front of me. So it says you should say the word emes. And then he read elsewhere, it says you should repeat the words Ani Hashem Elokeichem. And so there's actually a letter of the Rebbe to confirm that. So there's two issues here. One is the reason why we say the whole Krishma Shalom, the whole three parshas of Shema. We already said Shema at Ma'ariv. So why are we saying it at Shema again by Krishma Shalom Beito? So it says in Mogen Avraham, that's in order to, as a shmira for your Amachi Vorim. So you have 245 words in the Shema, and by Krishma Shalom Beito, very much the emphasis on shmira. That's why you have the Shishim Gibodim, and your Yorecha Hashem Yishmerecha, Yeshiva says, so all of these are inyan of shmira. And when you go to sleep, you need a shmira. So therefore you say, the Shema, you want to make sure you have the extra three words. So although in Hayom Yom it doesn't say that over there, it only talks about when you say Krishma early morning, if you're going to daven a little bit later, so you want to say Krishma to be Yotze Mitzvahs Krishma Shel Torah. So there it says you should say Hashem Elokeichem Emes twice, whereas in Rabbeinu Tam is not. But here in this letter, the Rebbe confirms the Krishma Shalom Mitzvah, you should be saying those three words. The Chiddush in Hayom Yom is like the word of Emes, and that's a separate Chiddush. The word Emes is the beginning of the after bracha of Shema, either Emes v'Yatziv or Emes v'Emunah, and therefore it would have been this questionable. Should you say the word Emes after Shema in the evening? And this is what it says in Hayom Yom to confirm that you say the word Emes in any case. Perhaps it's got to do with the idea of Hashem Elokim Emes, Hashem Hu Elokim Chaim, whatever the cheshbon is. So to answer that question, we do say we say Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Ani Hashem Elokeichem Emes. That's how you finish off the Shema before going to sleep. So with this, I'll end today's shir and wish you all a good Shabbos and a good Tavoch and a good Chodesh. And the Ikka we should see Geula Shlema, the Mashiach Tzidkenu, Serzen Einenu, B'shuch Cholitzin Berachamim. Also.